Great. I think we're ready to start. Welcome to our very first webinar in our series on the power of population data. We call this Data of the People, by the People, for the People. This webinar series intends to spark interest and also share knowledge on the importance of population data. You may ask, why population data? What is the urgency? What are its challenges? Population data is often not timely, accurate, or sufficiently inclusive, and you'll agree with me with this. Neither is it accessible. Yet this is among the most fundamental data that countries need so that they can ensure that there's efficient planning, there's sufficient delivery of services, but also for effective development programming to leave no one behind. We could go on. It can help with election preparedness and also timely responses to disasters. Population data, as we call it in our webinar series, is about people, and therefore it requires involvement of people in its collection and use. It definitely goes beyond the official data sources, but also allows us to include other sources of data that involves population. Our global partnership for sustainable development data partners have increasingly articulated the demand for our support to amplify the importance of these foundational systems. And through our Leave No One Behind collaborative and also our Citizen-Generated Data Task Team, we have developed this webinar series. Once again, a very warm welcome to you. I haven't told you my name. My name is Karen Bett, and I work as a policy associate with GPSTD, the Global Partnership, and I have the honor to be the moderator of this webinar. GPSTD, for those who may not know, was established to help stakeholders across countries and sectors fully harness the data revolution for sustainable development. Work together towards a world where data is being used more openly, effectively, and efficiently. In this webinar that we have invited you to join us for the next 1.5 hours, we will have an exciting discussion on citizen-generated data as our first webinar and its role in advancing sustainable development. With me, I have a wonderful panel to help us in this discussion. We will share findings from the CGD, Citizen-Generated Data Guide, that the CGD Task Team published earlier this year. We'll then hear from our speakers on their work on CGD. These are practical examples of CGD initiatives and projects that are ongoing across the world. And also we'll have a conversation about the key areas of opportunities to advance the conversation and the use of CGD in sustainable development. But before we jump right in onto the interesting conversation, I want to give just a little run of show. I would call it the logistics about this webinar series. We are recording this webinar and we will share the link after the call. We will also have a Q&A session once we hear from our speakers. We invite you to share your questions through the chat provision on your screen through the webinar, so you can ask a question as you listen to our speakers. Of course, we'd love to answer all your questions, but time will not allow. So we would like to just manage about 5 to 7 questions, depending on time in our webinar, and to allow our speakers to respond to these questions. Certainly, we'll want to respond to all the questions that we'll receive, and we'll do that as follow-up to this webinar. At the end of the webinar, we will have a poll. This enables us to know how well we did in this webinar, but also to request your feedback so that we can improve and help us plan the subsequent webinars. So with the logistics and the run of show aside, I'd like to introduce to you my panel. I mentioned that they're an exciting and wonderful panel. I have with me Daniel Lämmerhirt, who is a PhD student, but most of all, he helped us to author the CGD guide, and he will give a brief overview of the guide. Next, I will pass the baton to Victor Owusu, who works with the Ghana Statistical Services. He will give a reflection of the guide, but he'll also tell us about the work that the Ghana Statistical Service is doing on CGD in the country. Next, after Victor, I'll introduce to you Gertrude Elleamoh, who works with GIZ. GIZ have been funding citizen-generated data initiatives across the world. And Gertrude will help us, will tell us about these initiatives, but should also help us to reflect on the content of the guide and how they're applying this guide in their work. Lastly, I have Rob Worthington, who is also, who works with Quantu, but also is our CGD task team co-chair. Rob will help us share the learnings from the task team from this work, but also reflect on the feedback that we'll have received from Victor and Gertrude. And also he'll tell us about the way forward in terms of the work that we're doing as the CGD task team. So that aside, I'll want to now introduce Danny and give Danny a few minutes to tell us about the guide and take us through the guide. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. I hope you can all see my screen, and I have to, I think, minimize these items here. Yeah, hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having me today on this call. It is a real pleasure to be on this panel, especially with those people who actually do the groundwork and also learn from our research that we have done in the past. So that's quite exciting for me too. As Karen already mentioned, my name is Danny Lämmerhirt, and I am currently an independent research consultant and also a PhD candidate who works on data governance topics and data cooperatives in detail. But in the past, until last year, I was the research lead of Open Knowledge Foundation. And in that position, I was overseeing the production of the Citizen-Generated Data Report and the accompanying guide, both of which you should be able to see here. So the research we conducted last year consisted of two pieces. One was a report which should illustrate what citizen-generated data is, provide an analytical frame of how we can understand citizen-generated data as a concept, and also provide empirical cases what citizen-generated data does and how it can contribute to sustainable development. So what we've noticed quite early on in our research is that it is a very daunting task to try to frame or come up with a concept of citizen-generated data that is all-encompassing. So we limited ourselves to 3 illustrative areas of citizen-generated data, which are usually quite prominent, which are crowd mapping, and then citizen-led social auditing and community scorecards to measure public service performance, as well as environmental monitoring. The reason why we focused on these empirical cases was that we wanted to also be mindful to speak to different public institutions, from statistical agencies to public services and environmental agencies, who all have different interests in different types of data, but also we focused on areas that are very large in general and quite prominent and well developed as well. And during our research, as I said, we learned that the concept citizen-generated data is actually quite hard to pin down to one definition or an abstract framework, and which is why we developed a guide which should be some kind of reflexive tool or reflective tool for decision makers and designers, how they can engage with people in order to produce data together. So our intention was not to provide closed answers or some kind of definitive framework, but rather open up questions and spark imagination and thinking how one could engage with citizens and data. So the guide outlines 6 different steps to guide people through different questions that could occur during, for example, the planning or the management and delivery of citizen-generated data projects. One of them could be, for example, defining goals and the scope of the intervention. Another one would be, what is the purpose and the problem that you actually have, and how does the participation of people help? Why should we engage people in the first place? But also what resources are available and what methods need to be conducted. How can you make citizen-generated data public? And so on and so on and so on. So there are a range of questions which I won't go into detail, but I will try to illustrate the most important questions we came across that people can think of when conducting citizen-generated data work. Before I go into the guide more in detail, just a little recap of the original definition of citizen-generated data, which actually I think wasn't that much a subject of controversy within the citizen-generated data task team of GPSTD, but still I think there was some discussion what parts of this definition actually could be expanded or seen differently, and that's why I want to quickly talk about it. So this definition here comes from the NGO Civicus, as far as I'm aware. And it says that citizen-generated data is data that people or their organizations produce to directly monitor, demand, or drive change on issues that affect them. It is actively given by citizens, providing direct representations of their perspectives and an alternative to datasets collected by governments or international institutions. So this definition highlights three things. If you want, the first one is who collects data. It should be citizens or organizations on their behalf. So what we see here is both ideals of direct and indirect data democracy, if you want, which is quite interesting because, of course, both engaging people or organizations causes different dynamics in a project, which one needs to be aware of and change the nature of the project quite substantively. Then how should data be collected? It should be collected actively, and this suggests things like consensual data transfers or awareness that people produce data, but also issue-driven data production, as we see here. So the why is there must be a problem, an issue that people are affected by and that they want to address by collecting data. Actually, so I'm all with it here. I like this definition, but empirically, if we look into other or several cases of citizen-generated data, this is not always true that people want to, for example, address issues that affect them. Sometimes they are simply motivated by the fact that they want to learn more about their environment, for example. And also this point of actively given by citizens is, I think, a very good marker to separate citizen-generated data from big data and passive data tracking, like, for example, call detail records, which are quite prominent, I think, in the humanitarian sector. But yeah, what actively given actually means is also a subject of discussion. But in order to disentangle a bit this definition, we try to, with the guides, propose a couple of things people can think through in order to understand better what citizen-generated data is. So here we have three elements: purpose, the organization of participation, and the methods to generate data, which are all interlinked more or less and depend on one another. And I would like to illustrate it a bit now. So talking about purpose, usually there's a spectrum of reasons why public institutions want to engage with citizen-generated data. For example, they want to engage citizens. It's part of an engagement strategy. Sometimes they want to conduct research or want to improve management, and maybe also use citizen data as part of feedback loops to improve management. And sometimes maybe there's policy development involved, and governments want to have additional evidence to develop a policy, which is sometimes in the environmental protection space the case. And here we have several of these purposes lined out. For example, education, engagement with communities on the left side, and then on the right side, definition of policies and regulatory decision-making. So, and depending on each of these purposes, questions of course arise, such as, with whom should I cooperate to address the issue at hand? For example, do I want to collaborate with a large group of people to maximize engagement? Or do I want to work with a targeted group of people who are usually overlooked by service management and public services? Or do I want to work with a limited group of people, if I deal, for example, with sensitive data and I have to trust the people who I'm dealing with? And this is defined by the purpose and by the problem at hand, of course. And then a second question that comes up is, how sound must the data be in order to be applicable to these purposes? For example, if I want to engage people and educate them about how public institutions measure things, then maybe the data quality requirements might be lower than if, for example, baseline data should be gathered to enrich a scientific report that is written by a public institution. And what we have encountered is that public institutions are sometimes quite pragmatic and reflective also about the data quality requirements. And it seems that there's data often just needs to be good enough, and there seems to be, and this idea of data being good enough is something that more and more coming up in this space. But it is of course hard to pin down what this good enough actually means and how that can be defined. And I think we can learn here from the other speakers as well how they deal with that question. But it is something that we came across, the pragmatism in data quality here. To go back to the purpose real quick, citizen-generated initiatives also deal with different people who can maybe be engaged in the similar methods or same methods, but have different motivations, values, ethics. If you think about environmental justice initiatives, citizen science projects, social accountability initiatives, they might have different purposes to engage in this in a project as well. And these politics are often glossed over, but I think need to be taken into account. I'm already quite late with my presentation. I'm almost at 10 minutes, but let me just quickly go through the participation here. So participation, we've seen, can be organized or can be understood as breadth of participation, which means engaging citizens along the data value chain in different steps, but also depth of participation, which is more about what shall citizens learn while they participate. Is it about data literacy, or is it also about more institutional literacy and understanding how governments take up the data and process the data? And here we have a grid provided where we try to cluster or group the different tasks that citizen-generated data initiatives go through. For example, classifying and tagging images that are already existing, or compiling data in the enrichment step, or in the definition step, consulting with citizens, scoping the problems together, defining data points that matter to people. To individual citizens, group deliberation, action plans, campaigning. So these are all methods that might increase the breadth and the depth of the engagement, and something that people also have to consider when designing participation, that not all participation is equal here. And then lastly, the generating data aspect. Of course, depending on the purpose and the situation, sometimes data can be missing, and then we can speak about, for example, filling data gaps. But often, actually, we've seen that citizen-generated data is also about compiling, classifying, and translating already existing data, which actually suggests that citizens engage with official data in quite interesting ways that sometimes can improve the quality of official data. And we think that is important to also to consider that it's not only about filling data gaps. And the tools and collection protocols, of course, also come with different task difficulty, resource requirements, and allow for different ways of scaling. And here we have tried to group them together into web-based methods, automated methods, and field-based methods, which all have, of course, different requirements for the collector, for the citizen. Field-based methods, for example, might require ethnographic skills. They might require trust in the community in order to be in order to gain access to communities, whereas web-based methods can be done from afar through a digital interface. On your computer, you can tag images, you can maybe tell stories through data visualizations, as in the corner left. And then we have also automated methods which require usually sensor grids or camera networks in order to observe, let's say, wildlife population. And the relationship to the SDGs, I think there are 3 points here. Beyond filling data gaps and beyond seeing data as the new oil or as a resource that can be just mined or something, we think it is important to think of citizen-generated data as an act of citizenship. It creates new relations in public spaces and engagement. It can also inform, expand, and improve monitoring, not only replace data that is officially produced, but rather inspire, for example, new monitoring work by public institutions. Sometimes citizen data can also produce data in regions that are otherwise not reachable, or help cross-verify government data, and so on. So there are different use cases for citizen-generated data beyond filling data gaps. And then, of course, on the implementation front, it can also help, for example, enable planning, strategy development, resource allocation, and so on and so on and so on. But I'm conscious of time, and I know that I'm already above the allocated time slot. So I would keep it as it is now and pass over the microphone to Victor to hear about his experiences and so we can put more empirical meat to this quite abstract first presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Danny. I think that was an elaborate presentation with 10 minutes, and I'm sorry that the time was not enough. I'd like to pass this to Victor, as I mentioned. And Victor, I know what you'll talk about is obviously what Ghana Statistical Service is doing on matters citizen-generated data, but also talk about the quality framework, and would definitely welcome your reflections on the CGD guide and also the opportunities and maybe the lessons from Ghana Statistical Services. And I think this would be useful for other national statistical offices who are in this meeting to learn in terms of your experience. So over to you, Victor. Take it away.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor Owusu with Ghana Statistical Service. I'm a statistician, a demographer, and also I play a key role in coordinating SDG activities in Ghana. Ghana Statistical Service is a government institution solely responsible for collecting, compiling, analyzing, publishing, disseminating, and unofficial statistics in the country. And it's being headed by a government statistician with the 2 deputies, one in charge of operation and services. And we have 10 directors with sectional heads which help all the activities put together to achieve the common goal of the institution. So as been mentioned, Ghana Statistical Service operates on 3 traditional sources of data, that's censuses, surveys, administrative data. And in the exception of the SDGs, we are trying to also explore new sources of data for reporting SDGs in terms of satellite imagery and also the use of big data. And also having citizen-generated on board is also another way that Ghana Statistical Service has seen it as an important area to help us to also monitor the SDG. Although it has its limitations and it's something that we can't term as an official statistics, but at the end of the day, it gives a pointer or an area that the government and policymakers need to look at. Citizen-generated data, areas that Ghana Statistical Service is working on. We have 2 broad areas that we are working on for now, and it's in the pilot stage, and it's being supported by GIZ and Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. One is the environmental waste pilot project, where we are trying to use citizen-generated data in measuring SDG indicator 11.6.1, which talks about percentage of urban solid waste regularly collected and with adequate final discharge with regard to the total waste generated by the city. And as part of our processes, there are a few questions because it involves the citizens. There's a need for us to come up with questions, and we are using this USSD, a short code, where no matter the kind of phone that you use, with that short code, you can easily go into it, and questions will pop up for the citizens to share their view and make their input. Some of the questions under the environmental waste that we are proposing and is being looked and worked on and waiting for final approval is the type of waste generated at the district level, services provided in the district level, who collect the waste, who pays for the service providers, the volume of waste collected, and also the final destination of the waste. And in the final destination, we are talking about burying the waste, whether they take it to the dumping site, whether approved or unapproved. And also in the district where they have the compost plant, we ask whether the people take their waste to this compost plant. And we need the citizens to participate, although some of the surveys and censuses data that we always look at counting the entire population in the country. But at the end of the day, with the citizen-generated data, the people themselves are participating, and we expect that their views will shape the policy direction when it comes to waste generation and how we can manage it. Also on the gender pilot project, which is being spearheaded and supported by GIZ, is also helping us to also monitor SDG indicators 5.2.1, 5.2.2, 5.3.2, where it talks about women and girls, proportion of them who have undergone any sexual or psychological violence by a former or current intimate partner, or those who have been undergone female genital mutilation by age. And these are also being helped by questions that will help the citizens themselves to come out with how best they understand it. And we are cutting out, if you open the USDD, it gives an option for those between certain ages. So if someone log into the short code and that person is below the age range that we have provided, the person doesn't qualify to go into the platform. But those who are between the ages that have been stipulated on that platform, they can have the chance to participate. And it's a good way and an innovative way for citizens to participate in decision making, and also expecting that the results that come out from this survey, this citizen-generated data report, should be shared for them to know that yes, they contributed in coming out with this report, and they will also help and monitor the implementation of the decisions that come out from this report. On the data quality assurance framework, yes, Ghana have started something, and we have developed the data quality assurance framework, and it's in the process of coming to a final conclusion. And it's to understand the internal data quality control mechanisms used in the data producer community in our country, Ghana. It also assesses the statistical data ecosystem and what data producers are using, the methodology that they are going through. The objectives of this DQAF, that's Data Quality Assurance Framework, is to assess the quality of data production processes of major data producers in Ghana, with emphasis on existing internal quality and control measures, also to identify available skill sets on data quality assurance within the data production institution in the country, Ghana, and also to develop training guide to engage stakeholders in the data production space. And the institutions have been grouped under 4 main categories, and these institutions, the categories are public, that's government side, that ministry, department, agencies. We have the private sector institutions, we have the university, that's academia, research institutions, and also civil society organizations and NGOs. And we see them as a key players when it comes to our DQAF exercise. The scope of the assessment was to see the statistical system in place, also institutional environment, statistical processes, and also the kind of statistical output that each of these 4 categories come out with. And at the end of the day, we want to see results of it. And when the assessment was done, a lot of respondents had expectations. And among these expectations are respondents are asking or willing to see this DQAF provide better guidelines, consistency in procedure and methodologies, and adherence to ethical consideration in statistical production, and also the issue of data exchange or dissemination of data across different segments of users, and be addressed to encourage data and also knowledge sharing, and also strengthen collaboration and best practices, and reduce duplication that we have in our system. It should also be comprehensive and fit for purpose, and its governance structure should be flexible and responsive to the need of stakeholders. And one of the key expectations of respondents in this quality assurance framework assessment was to see that GSS should be empowered to take measures to get the buy-in of all stakeholders to participate in this activity. So to sustain the effectiveness and efficiency of the DQAF, 2 major committees have been set up, and one is the drafting team. Their purpose is to make sure that they develop and draft the data quality assurance framework to a standard that meets that of the UN guidelines. And also the second group is the steering committee. They are to see the policy direction of the DQAF, put up governance structures in place, and also supervise the drafting team's activity, and also setting up a body that will supervise the implementation of the DQAF. So this is a brief thing I can say about the data quality assurance framework. When it comes to the reflection on the guide and also the opportunities that is there for Ghana Statistical Service and other NSOs on citizen-generated data, it's very important as an institution that is mandated to coordinate national statistical system. There's a need for us to develop sectorial laws which will provide citizens' right to produce data and also incentivize departments. So if Ghana Statistical Service manage and able to come out successfully with the first report of our citizen-generated data, then it's going to be used as a use case to get a buy-in of the ministry, department, and agencies and see how best they can also help in using citizen-generated data for their daily activities and also shape their policy direction as an institution. Also, the proactiveness and communicating to people for them to also involve themselves in this citizen-generated data is a key thing that we have also taken it upon. And looking at our communication strategy that we have put in place to ensure that these two major programs that we are running as a country and as an institution, we make sure that every citizen in those selected districts that we are going to pilot these projects knows something about it and their role and their rights and whatever they have to do to get data for us is what we are stipulated, and it stands tall in our communication strategy. And also supporting other institutions to come on board, not that we don't see their data as official statistics, therefore we throw it away. No, we see how best those reports from the CSOs, NGOs will serve as a use cases and a pointer for the mainstream institutions like Ghana Statistical Service, ministry, department, agencies to see the directions where issues are coming from. When it comes to the CSOs, they also have a role to play because in Ghana, they are spread across all the districts in the areas that even the Ghana Statistical Service do not reach. And at the end of the day, because their work is in silos and they work in different occasions, there's a need for us to also see how best we can bring them on board and support their activity, especially when it comes to a specific issue that is bordering on individuals and the citizens as large. So citizen-generated data is something good. Apart from its limitations, there's something that we can learn from it and has a lot of advantage. One is enabling citizens and organizations to foreground, describe, and help addressing problems that are otherwise unnoticed in existing data collection, introducing political dynamics around problems which may open up spaces for collaboration, but also face resistance if problems are not acknowledged or prioritized by government, and also collecting information which will otherwise be considered not necessary but expensive. Then there's a need for us to see that citizen-generated data enables citizens to involve and also participate in whatever decision that goes on in their community. Some of the limitations that, as I keep on mentioning, has its limitation that I came across is one, data is not interpretable and verifiable. One, no methodology that's being used, no sampling frame is being used, and also differences from those of established official professional statistics when it comes to the whole processes that the statistical system have to go through to come out with the data that will term as official statistics. So in brief, this is what I have for our fellow participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. It was really interesting listening to you and sort of getting the point of view from Ghana Statistical Services and NSO, why you thought these CGD initiatives were useful, but also having that bigger picture of why it's important as the apex sort of supporting structured methodologies and guidelines through the DICA, the Data Quality Assurance Framework. I'd like to now invite Gertrude Elleamoh from GIZ to give her reflections. And I think definitely having worked with NSOs across the world, beyond Ghana, just some of your experiences, what was your motivation as a development partner to actually fund these initiatives, and also your reflections on the guide and how some of the lessons and experiences that other development partners can learn from you. So over to you, Gertrude.
Karen rightly mentioned, I am Gertrude Elleamoh. I work as a technical advisor within GIZ Ghana Decentralization Program, particularly Agenda 2030. And our objective is to ensure that quality and standardized data sets is available at a subnational level. I am really excited to be part of this panel as it affords me the opportunity to share my ideas on the topic concerning citizen-generated data, especially now that governments have acknowledged the fact that it holds great potential and are willing to move away from the traditional data sources to a more innovative way of collecting data. But then it is worthy of note that GIZ Ghana does not collect data in Excel, and we do not intend to do that because we don't want to have parallel systems and then it will be just like any other data. Probably it could even be labeled as GIZ data and it wouldn't be put into use. So for that reason, we are happy to support Ghana Statistical Service, which is a national statistical office, and for the first time are willing to use citizen-generated data to complement their traditional data sources. We are currently supporting them on two main projects, as Victor mentioned earlier. So the very first one is on environmental waste management, which is looking at empowering citizens to be actively involved in waste management, where they can use an app, an SMS, or phone in to report on poor waste management practices. The second project is on gender-based violence. It is realized that there are usually some gaps in gender data in Ghana. And we realized that using surveys and censuses, we usually would get data at really long intervals, usually 10 or 5 years. And if we need data now for policy making, if we need data now for decision making, then we need an alternative. And so this is where citizen-generated data affords us that privilege to have data to make policies and then improve the lives of citizens in Ghana. So what the Gender Project does is to also use phone-in, interactive SMS, and then an application where victims will anonymously report on gender-based violence. But then we also realize that data is not an end in itself. If we collect or produce all the data and it's not used to improve the lives of citizens, then we haven't done much. We would probably be lagging behind in achieving the Sustainable Development Goal. So with this project, since Statistical Service has the mandate to just produce the data, we feel it would be good to bring on board other stakeholders who have different mandates. So for the Gender Project, for instance, we brought on board the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection, who have the mandate to make policy and also to prosecute people like the perpetrators of gender-based violence. We also have the police service. We have the unit that is responsible for the social welfare of citizens. But then we realize that most often than not, this unit, which is responsible for the social welfare of citizens, do not have adequate resources in discharging their duties. So what we are doing in supporting GSS is to make sure that the data that we produce or the data that we support them to produce could be put into meaningful use. So we are advocating through the support that development partners, CSOs, academia, the private sector will all come on board, because we feel that one person cannot do it all. We cannot change the life of everybody alone. But then if we all pull resources together, we could support all these institutions who have the mandate to change the lives of the population. It would also interest you to know that we as GIZ, we do not have all the answers. Of course, this is an interesting area. It is new, and we are also here to learn from you, and we are open for suggestions and discussions. We feel that this project, since it's in its pilot stage, we don't have everything figured out. So for the guide that Danny assisted in preparing, it's going to be useful for us, because we could actually follow this guide and also think about the limitations of citizen-generated data. But of the limitations that were indicated in the guide, I feel the ones that are really critical is the debate that is surrounding the quality of CGD, which is citizen-generated data. It is most often debated that they have quality issues, but how do we work to improve on the quality of CGD? And that is where the project of Ghana Statistical Service on the data quality assurance framework could be very useful. So if they are done with their implementation, it will be worthy for GSS to ensure that all data that is produced within the country are vetted with these guidelines to ensure that they actually meet the standards that are stipulated in the data quality assurance framework guidelines. Also, the guideline for citizen-generated data that was helped to develop by Danny also made mention of how we could sustain the interest of citizens to continuously produce data or continuously give data to institutions who have the mandate to produce data in the country. And I feel this is where we could embark on a massive advocacy program. In my opinion, citizen-generated data thrive very well when communication strategy is elaborate and it's actually a step-down procedure where people can actually know the impact of the project and how they could continuously give their information. Focusing on gender-based violence, it is realized in Ghana that there is low reporting rate in the country. So what will motivate somebody to report on gender-based violence? Because the perpetrators are most often those who provide for the household, and they are usually close family relations. So why would I even want to report somebody who takes care of me? But then if as a country, if we have an institution with all the structures in place, I'll be motivated to report as a victim so that the perpetrators could be dealt with by institutions responsible for that. So in this case, if I am a victim of gender-based violence, I wouldn't be afraid to go to the police and then report, because I know the police will take charge of it. And even when the caretaker of my household refuses to take care of me, I know there is an institution who can adequately provide some sort of support in terms of shelter, in terms of psychological support, in terms of economic empowerment, so that I wouldn't always depend on my household head, who is usually my financier, if I would put it, right? So this data at the end of it all is going to help policymakers shape policies to reflect the realities on the ground. If we have data, we can as well advocate. We can as well advocate for support or collaboration from development partners, from international organizations. We can ask for support also from CSOs and then private institutions to come together to ensure that the structures are actually working. So I think the citizen-generated data is a good initiative. So it will be very good for everybody to rally behind institutions who are responsible for data collection to be able to collect the right data and in its disaggregated form, and also to meet the qualities that are stipulated in the SDG metadata framework to be able to advocate for policy change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gertrude, and I really loved listening to you and your passion. So, and I think the work that you're doing is sort of trying to also close the loop. So, as Ghana Statistical Services strengthen the systems to produce the data, you're also thinking about the use of the data in the end. Just to remind all our participants that we have a Q&A option where you can send in your questions, and thanks so much for those who've already sent in the questions. So please, we welcome your questions. I'd like to now pass this to my last speaker. Unfortunately, he's our last speaker, but Rob, you sit as the co-chair of the CGD task team, and you're actually instrumental in the developing and the publishing of the guides. Please tell us just from your experience and also from the task team, what are we learning from this experience and from these products, but also what do we want to take forward as the CGD task team that you're part of? And I think, obviously, to be fair to you, it would be helpful if you can reflect on what Victor and Gertrude have shared, and also what Danny has shared in terms of this is actually what's happening on the ground in terms of utilizing of the products, and also just advancing the role and the position of CGD in advancing sustainable development. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Karen. And thanks to my fellow panelists. It's been really, really interesting listening to your comments. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on. So I think from the task team perspective, my co-chair Rebecca and I think definitely would conclude that there is really significant interest in citizen-generated data. And we've seen that come from a diverse range of people and organizations, which is wonderful. And I think following that, there's a really strong appetite to understand and to use CGD as part of their work. And really, I think this talks to some of the points that Danny has raised in the piece of work that we did with him, which is CGD is something I think which is quite a hard concept to pin down. It's been a bit of work for us really to try and demystify what CGD is, and as Danny says, to kind of help open up thinking on how different organizations can engage with CGD. So I think, you know, we've made some good progress in those areas, but there's more work that we need to do to really achieve that. I think one of the exciting things that we've seen through the work Danny's done is the ability to point people towards some of the more established tools and methods that are out there, and ones that are promising in terms of working in different contexts and the potential to scale them. Just touching on some of the other comments, it's very exciting, you know, as we see from the other panelists, to see this interest and uptake of this work by NSOs and donors. And you know, really wonderful, I think, that we're hearing from Ghana Statistical Services how they're exploring CGD as one of several new sources of data that they can use to complement existing work. You know, the work that Victor's talking is indicative of other NSOs, and there are other examples that we're aware of and we're tracking to kind of follow. So it's great to hear about those pilot projects. I think the quality assurance framework that Victor talked about is a really, really critical area. It's so needed to bridge CGD, which is, as Danny kind of told us, is ultimately problem focused, and, you know, has this concept of the data quality being good enough to solve whatever the problem is, versus NSOs, which obviously have a very different perspective and very different level of standards. So how do we kind of bridge those two is a really critical question, and I think we're keen to follow the work that GSS is doing, but also to engage with other NSOs. And I think the more we can understand different perspectives on this, then the more we can do to kind of bridge these two areas. But obviously behind that, and I think, you know, this is something that one of the people, one of the participants has mentioned in the Q&A, there is of course this tension. You know, CGD is something often being developed by citizens themselves to solve problems. How does that fit with government, which have different priorities in some cases? So there is a tension there that I think we need to acknowledge and recognize, and we need to think, how do we deal with that? From Gertrude's perspective, I think really interesting to hear the interest from her side in terms of the ability of CGD to provide timely data, the kind of cost effectiveness that it brings in terms of providing an ongoing time series, and how it has the potential to inform policy and to shift realities, to inform policy and help it change and respond to realities on the ground. So I think there's some very promising work going on there. In terms of the task team, I mean, there's so much that we could do, and I think we want to be led by where there is a need. I think going forward, much of our work will be to continue to engage wider audiences so that we can learn more of what's happening, more of what the opportunities are, and where this can be best applied, and what is needed to support that. So we're very open to ideas and questions from others. In terms of our specific agenda, I think we see the need to continue this journey towards standardization. I think, you know, recognizing the need for variation and recognize the need for things to be context specific, but at the same time, the more we can hone in on some of the more common methods and models that work, that are proven to be effective, that talk to the data quality questions, that are scalable, you know, the more we can do here. Behind that, an area we're looking at is data standards. So how do we begin to standardize the kinds of data that different organizations collect so that it's interoperable? I think several times people have touched upon the concept of data governance. This is a really critical area which I think is coming up across the GPSSD's work. So that's a critical area for CGD as well. NSO involvement, as I've touched upon already, really important, and I think we need to consider how we go further with that. I think we're still in a kind of a learning mode, but in the back of our minds as a task team is very much this concept as to if there is value in establishing a city group on citizen-generated data as part of UN stats. This would really help to kind of formalize one or more specific methods or models which would be considered, acceptable across NSOs. So that's a really long-term objective there. Finally, I think we mustn't miss this question around using data. I mean, CGD is problem-focused, and I think how do we link this data to relevant decision-making processes? And for me, in particular, I'm very interested in this cycle between administrative data and citizen-generated data at local levels. How do those become more connected? How do we make sure that CGD is more usable to solve problems of the kinds that Gertrude was talking about? So lots of ideas there that are kind of bubbling away, but very much we're keen and interested to hear from others as to where else you think we should be focusing our time and energy. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Robin. Thank you for reflecting on the CGD, the guide, and also what Ghana Statistical Service and GIZ are doing. We're not doing so badly with time, and so I want to just pass this to Danny, because you started and you spoke quite elaborately on the guide, and having listened to the three speakers, Victor, Gertrude, and also Rob, I'd like to get your reflections also of what you're hearing, and also what you think could be the next steps. And then once Danny speaks, we'll go into Q&A. And thank you so much for your questions that are flowing in. So Danny, do you want to take about 3-5 minutes to just reflect also on what you've had and how the guide has been utilized?
Sure. Thank you. This is a good question. I think, I see there's a poll coming up here. I think the topic of data quality assurance is something that, we also came across during our research. And it is a quite interesting topic to think more about, to what extent it includes and excludes different types of knowledge. And I think when we think about citizen-generated data, it's just different ways of crafting and producing and foregrounding knowledge and perceptions, perspectives, which might not abide by statistical standards, but which still show sentiments, for example, and something that community scorecards, for example, is one method do. I think the question is, what do quality standards achieve, and whose standards we implement? And this is just something that so I was thinking a bit more when diving into quality standards that are already established in the US for gathering crowdsourced data. There is something that I think is used for more than 10 or 20 years by the Environmental Protection Agency. Some people say it is a device to bridge, of course, to gesture towards the broader public, you are invited to produce data, but it can also be a policing device to say, well, not all of the knowledge that you are producing is actually relevant for us. So I'm just wondering what this, how maybe also Victor and Gertrude have thought about this dynamic of, clinging to quality standards, but at the same time also making space for experimentation and maybe, listening to, for example, surprising insights that might come out of other methods, let's say, for example, community scorecards or other data methods that might be experimented with. I'm not sure. Just asking you the question, and you can see whether you want to address that or not. But I think moving forward, one of the things that we've also learned is that data governance, in a sense of data rights, as it is discussed right now, let's say in America and in the European Union with GDPR, is something that is not really part of the citizen-generated data discussion, but I think we should also think about, for example, questions of agency, of what happens with the data once it is resourced from someone. And what we've noticed is with citizen-generated data that we actually have a quite complex network of citizens we engage with, but then there are also the community organizations using the data. They can then take it up and do something else with the data. Of course, there are methods like stakeholder meetings where everyone gets together and talks about what is done with the data. And I think that also speaks to some of the questions here. How can we make sure that we understand what actually is done with the data? But I think data governance frameworks could also ensure that data that is resourced from some or that is used from some groups and populations is also it is clear for what purpose it is used, and that there are limitations to purpose, for example, which of course might be a bit contradicting to this idea of sparking imagination and being innovative with data. So I think there's a balancing act here to go. But I would maybe pass over hand over the word to Victor and Gertrude to maybe respond to these comments and also to the questions that came in.
Thanks so much, Danny. I think you've given the first question, so I'll give you the honors of allowing Victor and Gertrude to respond to your question, and then I'll open to the wider Q&A. I think for Victor and Gertrude, Danny is just checking about the space for experimentation. So to what extent can we develop standards and guidelines and methodologies on CGD, and what's the risk that this can also close the space for experimentation and this freeness of allowing CGD to also just be open and allowing experimentation? And the second question, and I think he wants to check with you also, is on data governance. And as the world gets into the space of data protection and security and privacy, how are we thinking about data governance when it comes to citizen-generated data? And is this something that the data quality assurance framework includes and involves? So do you mind maybe responding to that, and then we can open the Q&A for the rest of the participants?
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for your question. I think for the methodologies, yes, there's a need for us to come up with a standard method that we need to make sure we can employ for citizens to also use, and also share as an experience for other NSOs to also develop. For the core cast, yes, it's something that we have planned as one of the methods that we'll be using in these two major pilot projects that we are using. We are going to carry out. Aside the short code that we are going to give it to citizens for them to log in, for them to access the questions and also respond to the questions that pop up on their phones, we are also having in mind the use of call cards. So for us to develop a standard methodology, I'm proposing that there's a need for us to come up with the first phase of the pilot project, disseminate the results, open up to stakeholders for them to make an input as a NSO and as also a body that's coordinating national statistical system. We don't want to sit at our office, develop something and impose on stakeholders who are also interested in also taking part in citizen-generated data production. What we want to do is come out with the result from our two major pilot projects, disseminate, and at the launch of it, we allow stakeholders to make an input, and that one will shape the methods that we need to do. When it comes to the data governance, yes, Ghana Statistical Service is being backed by law, and recently our law has been amended, and that's had Parliament approving it, waiting for President of Ghana to give its assent for us to start implementing it. We also have the Data Protection Commission, and we work together. Data Protection Commission and GSS work together to ensure that any venture or any activity that we want to go ahead and carry out in our country, bordering on data generation, we need their consent and they have to give approval. So it's something that we have been doing when it comes to call detail record, when it comes to the use of satellite images, is something that they are aware of, and we have been speaking with them, we are always with them, and they are aware. So having these two bodies coming together and their operations being backed by law help to make sure that moving on into citizen-generated data, we can also develop laws that will empower MDAs to also come out with innovative ways of improving citizen-generated data system so that they can also use it and also empower the citizens to involve themselves. Forgetting about you are reporting someone, giving data and the consequences of it. No, when it's being backed by law, you empower the citizen to also make sure that whatever is given out, the law is backing him and he has the confidence of carrying out that exercise. This is my initial response. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Gertrude, do you want to come next?
Yes, Karen. As I indicated earlier, these two projects, or even citizen-generated data, is a new area that has come on board. And in Ghana, with the support we are providing to Ghana Statistical Service, it is a pilot phase, and we are now experimenting to ensure that it is a good measure or is a good pointer before we even include other indicators on board. Because until the pilot is over, where we can come up with lessons learned, we can't really shape the guidelines that we would have to use in collecting data on using citizen-generated data. And in talking about data governance with respect to data protection and privacy issues, I feel in the context where we usually dwell on government institutions to provide us with data, it will be good to encourage all citizens, like it will be good to encourage people in academia and other people who are interested in producing data to come on board, because it doesn't have to just be government institutions producing data. We can as well look at the other interesting areas where development partners can also support. In this context, we see that most development partners have varying interests, but then it would be good to know the indicators that are of interest to the various ministries, districts, and then agencies, what they really need, and then we can push our support to them. In Ghana, for instance, we have the data protection law, which actually protects the data of citizens, and Ghana Statistical Service has that mandate. So even though they are supposed to produce data, they are also entitled, or they are mandated to ensure that the data that is provided by citizens are protected and it's not out in the open for people to know who is given which data and at which point in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gertrude. And I want to move to the Q&A session now. We have 4 questions, and I'd like us to discuss all these questions. And just so you know, we've opened the poll to receive your feedback on this webinar. So before the end of the webinar, please, we'd appreciate your feedback. The first question comes from Rahim Abbas, and I think this is a question for all of us, and I think I'd want to start with Victor, Gertrude, Danny, and Rob. Feel free to jump in. Rahim asks, what can we do to ensure that we're increasing data utilization? So his point is, we have data collection. It's not strange. It's not a problem in sub-Saharan Africa. But how do we strengthen data utilization for policy making, budget planning, or even innovation in sustainable development in sub-Saharan Africa? I'll give each of our speakers 2 minutes. I'll start with Victor, Gertrude, Danny, and Rob in that order. So let's first respond to Rahim's question.
Thank you very much. For us to ensure quality data from citizens and also upscale it to every community and locality, there's a need for us to let those who give us the data know what the data is being used for, what policy change has it occurred in his life, his locality, and the community that he lives. If you enter somebody's households, you ask questions about what he eats, what he uses, where he disposes his waste, issues on gender base, and at the end of the day, you don't come back to that person. The person feels like he has wasted his time. So there's a need for us to always go back to respondents so that although they experience this respondents fatigue, but having their issues aired and heard by policymakers will make them more out and strong for them to always give data out for us to driven our decisions as a national development. Thank you.
Thank you. Gertrude, do you want to come next?
Yes, yes. It is realized that data is not an end in itself. So after producing data and nothing is done of it, or there is no impact, I feel we would have failed as people within the data ecosystem or as data producers. So in producing data, it will be right to know what the data is actually meant for and what sort of questions are we collecting the data for. Is the method that we are using going to actually respond or be a best fit for the questions that we intend to answer? And so even before we begin with our data collection, it will be right for us to bring the different stakeholders on board, like together, to solicit their views from the different perspectives they are coming from. Because if you want to change policy, if you want to advocate for some sort of change, you would need data to back it. But then if you don't include people or the institution, the right institutions who can be able to contribute to the change, then I don't see how the change could be effected, right? So with respect to GIZ, for instance, in support to Ghana Statistical Service concerning the waste and gender, somewhere last year, together with a Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Goals, we brought together different stakeholders. So people from the various ministries, we brought together similar institutions from Kenya together for us to all brainstorm. So during the planning processes, if everybody is involved or the institutions that has the mandate are all put together, if they bring their sort of buy-in, then it could lead to policy change. But until that is done, I don't see how we could effect some sort of change with the data that we produce. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gertrude. I think you're talking about us championing and actively involving decision makers as you collect this data. Danny, do you want to come next?
Yes, this is a tricky question. The thing is, of course, the question of interfacing or producing data that can be taken up by policymakers is something that, you know, even if we have standardized data that fits bureaucratic forms and abides by the standards of how a bureaucratic apparatus thinks, it doesn't mean that it's taken up. What I think, and Rob has, of course, much more experience on the ground working with, for example, the community scorecard method. But what I wanted to illustrate with breadth and depth of participation is that, you know, in the beginning, what also Gertrude said, soliciting views from different groups, trying to understand what data points need to be collected, by what standards should we, for example, measure a health service. Here we have the example of healthcare. And then auditing, for example, the health service according to the standards of citizens is something that I think is quite promising in this. It doesn't really respond or correspond to the question here, but I think in order to ensure the take-up of data that is produced, one thing that we came across not only in the case of community scorecards, but also auditing, cooperative auditing between the Commission on Audit in the Philippines and civil society groups in the Philippines. What they do is actually quite similar to community scorecards. They try to audit according to standards of the Commission on Audit, and then they collect together the data and develop recommendations what should be done based on the perspectives of citizens who are involved, for example, also in the analysis of the data. So that's what I wanted to illustrate with, you know, the breadth of participation is not only about collecting the data, but also having a lot of very old-fashioned interfaces, like, you know, speaking to one another. It doesn't have to do with developing an API and a fancy database or a dashboard, whatever, but just getting together and try to get into people's heads that some of the things that are awkward or wrong in public services are not necessarily something that should offend the people who develop the services, but it is just about, you know, doing things differently. And I think these sessions, for example, could help in local health services to improve the services. But of course, policy making on a larger scale is a whole different issue. So, but maybe Rob, over to you. I don't want to dominate here because we only have 17 minutes.
Thanks, Danny. I mean, I think it's a really important question, Rahim, and I would echo a lot of what Danny says. It's very complex. I think the only way we're really going to see any progress in this area is to be very focused on specific contexts or examples. I mean, coincidentally, I'm at the moment focusing on exactly this question, specifically around community scorecards as a tool. So what does it mean to enable groups to use data generated by community scorecards effectively? And as Danny, I think, has alluded to, I think to some extent this is happening already. I mean, there was a colleague, I think, has left us now from World Vision on the call. They are very effective at this. They will organize community level discussions using the data from community scorecards to engage with local representatives to try and solve problems. So that's happening already. But obviously it gets more complex when that needs to happen at a higher scale. If the kinds of problems raised are not things that can be solved locally, maybe because of where decisions need to be taken. So I don't by any means claim to have the answer to this, but I think one approach is to think, what are the kinds of processes and decisions which data can help to make, and what are the different levels at which these operate at? So obviously some decisions could be made, if we follow your example, Rahim, at the health facility level. Some might need to be made at a higher level, perhaps district or provincial, depending on the kind of hierarchy in your country. Some maybe even national. From that, I think we can start to understand by talking to the different stakeholders, what are the scenarios that would help them to make decisions. You know, how should the data be presented? What are the kinds of scenarios in which they need to make decisions? And of course, we mustn't forget, of course, what support is needed to develop capacity to use data, and of course, to try and build this culture of data-driven decision-making. So I think there's a lot in there, and I think really the only entry point is to get very specific and focus on one kind of tool or one context to try and understand this. Otherwise, you can easily get overwhelmed and achieve not much.
Thank you very much. I have the next question, which is specifically for Gertrude, and then I'll have the last question where I've combined Charles's and Majawi's question. So a question to you, Gertrude. Your project is interesting and in a very challenging area. So Albert would like to know, have you talked to data users in ministry, the police? What kinds of measures are they looking for? What kinds of indicators do they say is most relevant or are more relevant to the information needs? And what kinds of policies do they seek to inform? Don't forget also that civil society are also data users as well. So huge question for you, Gertrude, but please, would you respond to Albert?
Thanks for the question, Albert. I indicated earlier that the project is in its pilot phase, and we are now having the deliberations with the different stakeholders involved. And so, yes, we've had quite a number of engagements with the ministries, with policymakers, and we are still figuring things out. Things are not that laid out yet, but then we are still figuring it out. And we are planning on in bringing on board some CSOs as well, because we feel they would engage with the citizens and they can reach more people than even the ministries or departments and agencies. So yeah, the issue of CSOs is also really critical that we have considered to bring on board. At the moment, we even work with the CSOs platform, for instance. So in most of our engagements, we involve them to know how they also think from the perspective of CSOs, or like thinking about citizens using the eye of the steers. Yes, we've spoken to policymakers, we've spoken to the respective agencies involved, but we are now figuring it out on what direct indicators we intend to measure and all that. But then we have some indicators from the Sustainable Development Goals. We have, those ones are clearly spelled out, but then the roles of these agencies are now being figured out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gertrude. I think what you're saying is you're still trying to sort of, it's still a learning process, and given that you're among the first in the world, to be honest, trying to do this. So actually, there's some lessons for other development partners as they roll out CGD projects, and I think it would be really useful to know more of your lessons and experiences. I'm aware of the time, and I want to just move to the last question, which I would request all my speakers to respond to, and then we can do a wrap up. So the question from Majawi, and I'll combine that with the question from Charles, is Majawi is asking, we're already struggling with consistent data from other data sources, different lingos, different standards, different classifications. How do we enforce consistent data with citizen-generated data, which is collected across a wide variety of contexts? So Majawi is trying to see, is the data going to be consistent, timely, and also available when we expect it to be available? So I'd like everyone of my speakers to speak about the consistency issue, but also there's a question that Charles asked in terms of accuracy and yeah, the quality and accuracy of data. So what's the role of NSOs in helping ensuring this accuracy of the data and the quality? Victor, do you want to go first in that order? So Victor, Gertrude, Danny, and then Rob.
Thank you very much. So before I go to this one, I want to add something to what Gertrude said concerning the project that we are running. So for now, on the waste environmental waste projects, instead of Ghana Statistical Service hosting it, we are partnering with the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources, which is a body, is a ministry that is responsible for waste issues in the country, and we are asking them to own it. We will be interested in the data side of it, but when it comes to the policy direction, then the ministry have to do that, and that's what we are doing now. When it comes to data consistency and accuracy, Ghana Statistical Service with support from United Nations Statistics Division started developing metadata and data templates to help ministries, departments, and agencies to ensure that the data that they come out with is of high quality. Most of the issues is that when data comes, it doesn't come with metadata, so you find it difficult to understand what this data means, who is responsible, the source of that data. So with this citizen-generated data and how it will be more accurate and consistency, if all variables are well defined, is well stipulated, and before it goes out, a team will go into the community, sensitize the community members. Citizens are well aware of what this data means to them, and then coming back to the NSOs and also the body that is carrying out this exercise for explanation will help them to understand. But if data comes and it doesn't come with a metadata, you find it difficult to measure it as quality. And also consistency depends on what the institution want to focus on. If Ghana Statistical Service is focusing on health, population issues, and security issues, it should be something that we do maybe quarterly, biannually, or annually. And that one will be a vision by the institution to carry out this exercise and make sure that that data, because it's helping us to target a certain indicator or a pointer for national development, there's a need for us to ensure that timeliness and accuracy of that data is well noted, and we need to carry out that exercise also. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Victor. Gertrude, do you want to jump next?
Coming from the perspective of GIZ, I do not think we have the mandate to restrict international institutions to produce the data according to certain classification or standards. But what we can do is advocate or like have continuous engagement with them, so that they could also, in producing data, they could also abide by the guidelines that will be produced. Like for instance, the data quality assurance framework that will be produced by Ghana Statistical Service, so that we could have some sort of harmonized data across board. So whether the data is being produced by an international organization or is being produced by a government agency, we know that the definitions are the same. So, and whatever the metadata requires of it is being followed to the word, and not necessarily because you are an international organization, you have a different mandate, you could just produce any sort of data. But then I would rather encourage or advocate all partners within the data ecosystem to follow the standardized procedure where we could all have a harmonized data set. So even if the data is being produced by a different organization, we know that the metadata, the definitions, and all methodologies are the same. So it wouldn't be much of a problem. But then if in situations where, as we are having now, where the definitions are a bit different, it makes comparability a bit difficult. So if we could all have a standardized metadata, I think it would be a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Gertrude. Danny, do you want to go next, and then over to Rob?
I think it is a really tough. It's the $1 million question, maybe even a $1 billion question. Whoever can come up with the right standardization tools, right? I'm actually not sure. So I'm aware that there are standardization efforts going on. For example, in the citizen science space, where people try to identify interoperability mechanisms to make data sets speak to one another. There is, of course, a tension between, I think what we have to acknowledge is that people with different interests in data want to see different things, and that's the fitness for purpose wicked problem, if you want, that standardizing data in one way takes away aspects of a data set that the data set can tell, which is more relevant maybe for people who have collected the data. So I don't have an answer for that, and I'm not sure whether it's even useful. I think it is a problem, but we have to ask ourselves to what extent it is a problem and to what extent it is an argument against citizen-generated data, but I have no answer for that. I think, Robert, you have much more experience in that field, so I would rather give you some time to respond to that question.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, it's definitely something that I've thought a lot about. As you said, it's extremely hard to do, and I would agree with your and Gertrude's point as to whether there is a need or value for this to happen. I think what I've seen is there needs to be very strong incentives for organizations to want to share data, to want to collect data in a comparable and interoperable way. And if that doesn't happen, then this isn't going to happen. So I think the discussion is around what are those incentives. I'm working on this at the moment. There's a partnership that I have, Quantu has with World Vision and CARE, which is looking at exactly this question across their programming, and we actually now have the opportunity to kind of pilot this in Malawi. So hopefully next year we'll be able to share some more concrete findings. What we've seen so far from discussions with Malawian organizations is there is obviously this question of greater credibility. If they are collecting data in comparable ways and they can put that data set together, it gives them more credibility, gives them the potential to take collective action. And I think there's also a donor incentive in terms of, how can donors support this and how can they, I don't know if I want to go as far as making this a precondition for funding, but obviously see this as a positive thing if organizations are thinking and working in that way. So I think that's a key part of this. Some of the things that we've been looking at are how can we create a standard way of collecting data for community agreed across CARE and World Vision, and we're beginning now to consult with others in Malawi to extend that. That's effectively a standard set of questions and response options, and it's a standard data format. And then obviously to make that work are tools that can integrate data from other sources where it's being collected to control how that data is shared. And then of course, backing that up, a data governance piece to look at how that group of organizations can manage and use that data. So there's a lot there. It's a complex area. So, you know, as I said, hopefully we can share some more lessons and learning from that at some point next year.
All right, thank you so much. I'd want to give a big thank you to my panelists for having worked with me through this session, this 1.5 hours, and also a big thank you to my attendees. This is coming to an end, but I want to just give my speakers just half a minute each, strictly half a minute, to give just a parting shot before I wind up. Again, Victor, Gertrude, Danny, and then Rob.
Thank you very much, and I think this is a great day done on us, and as institution, we need to set a pace. Ghana Statistical Service needs to be a pace setter when it comes to citizen-generated data with support from GIZ, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, will help us to make sure that we get a buy-in of the ministry, department, and agencies for them to see how best they can also integrate that into their activity moving forward. Thank you.
So, from my end, I would stress more on collaborations and partnership between national statistical offices, private sectors, CSOs, all other stakeholders who are in the data ecosystem to come together so that we don't have parallel systems set in place. And at the end of it, all efforts will be duplicated. So it will be better to always have a harmonized data set which can be used to effect policy change. Thank you.
Yeah, I think on my end, I would advocate for seeing citizen-generated data, as I said, not as a resource only to fill data gaps or to think too narrowly in let's say, for example, statistical terms or in a particular method, but rather as a way to experiment with new ways of seeing and also allowing new ways of seeing that are not bound by, for example, a lot of quality requirements and a lot of these wicked problems that we see, but rather try to experiment with them and see what we can learn from them. That would be my recommendation.
I've learned so much just from hearing the other panelists, so that's been fantastic. And I would look forward to also learning from the attendees as well. I think I'd encourage you, we'll include in the follow-up information about the CGD task team. So we'd love to hear from you if you have work you're doing in the space, questions, ideas that you want us to consider. So